So the form of military tech that we know now is the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army, and all the technology that they use. But technology is evolving very rapidly. There's a role of AI in the military at this point. There's a huge role of drone warfare. And a lot of this future military tech is being built in America, in Israel, in Russia, and India is in the process of, for lack of better words, importing that tech into our own country for the sake of our military. The one thing that I know about our military after all the episodes that we've done with the special forces vets and the soldiers is that they keep an eye on the conflicts that are happening in the modern day. So they keep a very close eye on what's happening in the Ukraine Russia situation as well as what's happening currently in Israel. Uh, India's upgrading its own military.
I just wanted to, if I could, Ranveer, take a step back and try to paint for the audience a picture of the broad arc of technological development on the battlefield over the last, say, 100 years or so. Of course, one could consider even the evolution of the club to the bow and arrow, to advanced, composite bows and so on and so forth, as forms of technological change on the battlefield.
Which is a very key aspect of who wins a war.
No, absolutely. And so, the most powerful ancient example that I can give you, and maybe we won't spend too much time on ancient history in this episode, although I think that as a historian myself, I like to understand most things by starting at the beginning. So, in order to understand what's going on with technology on the battlefield today, I very much try to develop an understanding of how the long arc of technological development has occurred. But I'll give you one quick example. The earliest form of organized, sophisticated warfare depended a lot on chariots. I mean, we have it in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, but if you look at ancient Egypt, if you look at the sort of societies of the Bronze Age before the Bronze Age collapse, chariot-based warfare was quite ubiquitous. The single greatest innovation that occurred on the ancient battlefield is to actually switch to a cavalryman, i.e., to switch to a man on top of a horse, as opposed to, one, two, or four horses or three horses pulling a man in a chariot.
The logic of a chariot was probably that it provided another armor, right, around the warrior.
Well, I mean, to be honest, it just required less skill as well, right? You didn't need to be a rider. You didn't need to be an expert horse rider capable of actually being on top of a horse at full gallop and trying to charge into an enemy line. So, it was a fundamental innovation in warfare that was brought by the steppe peoples from the Central Asian steppe. And they, ended up dominating the battlefield for hundreds of years thereafter. Or cavalry ended up dominating the battlefield for, because of mobility, speed, the shock of the impact of a horse charging, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason I give you this example is that I think that if you look at the history of warfare, you'll find these revolutions in military affairs keep occurring. And I can point you to, at least one or two in recent history, but I would argue that we're in the middle of a revolution in military affairs now as we speak. And that's to do with unmanned platforms, what we call drones in the air, but unmanned submersibles, unmanned ground vehicles, paired with extremely sophisticated software, or in other words, AI.
So you're saying that unmanned drones are going to kind of, for lack of better words, replace the Air Force?
Yeah, so I mean, what's been going on as far as this current revolution is concerned for the last 20, 30 years is it started in the US, as you mentioned, with platforms like the Predator drone that we saw in the early 2000s with the global war on terror. And back then, Ranveer, drones felt almost semi-mythical. Only the United States, which is the most advanced defense power in the world, is capable of putting up technology where you have a pilotless aircraft effectively that's capable of flying at equivalent altitudes, speeds, endurance, and so on and so forth. And in fact, in many cases, greater endurance than manned aircraft, because you don't have a man in it. So he doesn't need to rest or sleep or eat or, and so on and so forth. And so we first saw on this planet in this era, drones coming out of the US arsenal in the early 2000s. But what's happened since then in the last 20 years effectively is, as a combination of developments in hardware and software, drone technology has become more and more ubiquitous, right? So now when you and I attend a wedding, there's drone photography. Real estate developers will use drone photography to sell apartments. Or for disaster relief, drones have become widely used for surveillance. Or if you want to, conduct a nationwide mapping exercise for geospatial mapping, again, drones can be incredibly useful and effective. So over the last couple of decades, what we've seen is this explosion of relatively small, relatively cheap, very useful civilian applications for drones. But what's also been going on simultaneously is enormous developments on the battlefield. And so, what I mean there and what I can point to now is the trend that we see really starting with the conflict in Armenia in 2021 between Azerbaijan and Armenia. What military observers, and you said that our armed forces are also very, very close students of what's going on in the world. That's absolutely correct. I'm sure that they all noted, like the rest of the world did, that a legacy army in that conflict with superiority in terms of numbers of tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, men, etc., got absolutely devastated by the deployment of a large number of relatively cheap and unsophisticated battlefield drones by the other side. Azerbaijan managed to use a very large number of Turkish-made drones in order to deal a pretty significant battlefield defeat to Armenia. And there's an interesting geopolitical conundrum there because India is quite close to Armenia, but Russia is quite close to Azerbaijan. Iran has its own views on the conflict, but obviously India is quite close to Russia for other reasons. So it's a very interesting dance that's being danced there even today. And I don't know if you read, but India has been quite supportive militarily, at least in terms of supply of equipment and ammunition and so on, to the Armenians. So we seem to be taking the stance that we're backing the Armenians to defend themselves against the Azerbaijanis. But to come back to the point of the conflict was it kind of announced to the world that all of the theories of drone warfare are now a reality, and a reality beyond just the United States and their mythical predator. I mean, this is by any stretch of the imagination, a middle-ranking power deploying what should seem to everyday people extremely futuristic technology and doing so successfully.
Gotcha. Sorry, I got to pause you again. You spoke about water-based drones and land-based equipment as well.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, what is the land-based thing?
No, I mean, so in general, when we just think about any current vehicle, right, and think of it as an unmanned platform. Just remove the pilot or driver,
Okay.
right, and replace that individual either with a remote pilot, so someone that's still controlling the vehicle but is nowhere near where the vehicle is operating, completely remote. And then the sort of next step, the real advance is, can you remove even the remote pilot so that that platform is effectively running itself, driving itself?
Self-driven cars.
So think Tesla full self-driving, except on the battlefield, in the air, on the ground, or on the water.
Okay. When we're talking about drones or these water drones or the self-driven cars that you just spoke about, how do they actually attack the enemy? Are there guns attached? Are they explosive devices themselves? Do they work as a group of units together like a swarm of bees? So can we boil it down to basics and can you paint out a picture? My understanding is that it depends totally on the military using them, and this is where drone warfare based strategy comes into play.
That's right. No, you're exactly right, Ranveer. So the short answer is all of the above. I'll try and paint a picture for you and try to break it down. The first and most obvious use of drones, and by that I mean let's use drones to refer only to unmanned air vehicles for a minute, right? We'll discuss ground vehicles and submersibles separately if needed. As far as unmanned air vehicles are concerned, the number one use, the first thing that any military will look to do is what the armed forces call intelligence, surveillance, and recon, or ISR. What this effectively means is your eyes and ears on the battlefield, in simple terms. Back in the day, you'd effectively have recon units or scouting units that would be a part of larger units that would go out in advance of a major movement to just get intelligence about what are the enemy dispositions, where are they strong, where are they weak, Can we make sure that they don't know about an impending attack? Or can we get early warning about any impending move by the enemy? That role was performed by scouts historically, right? Way back through history and all the way up until the modern period. The effectiveness, the brutal effectiveness of drones in that function have made them the number one platform bar none for that function. Now, even within that function, remember, Ranveer, you've got everything from the small drones that will travel a distance of 5 kilometers to the big drones that will go up to 200 kilometers. Right? You have differences, therefore, also in terms of the altitude at which this drone flies, how silent it is, and based on the altitude, what sort of range of camera it needs, because at the end of the day, you want an eye in the sky, so you want full mission video available for wherever your drone is, so that, you know, the commander in the base is getting to see a live picture of the battlefield. So in that world, you basically have a whole range of drones that are doing one mission, which is intelligence, surveillance, and recon. A small special forces unit might take a drone that can fit into their backpack and fly it just to conduct recon 5 kilometers away from wherever they are during a mission. A large unit might have a whole team of drones flying, you know, 100-kilometer radius around it to make sure that nothing's coming close to it or to get early warning, right? So depending on the context, you'd use different platforms, but fundamentally you're doing the same thing. You're trying to get better battlefield information.
Gotcha.
Now, the second type of use, what, you know, again in the armed forces they call a direct strike platform or a kinetic platform, or in other words, a loitering munition, is effectively where you have a drone that is capable on command to convert itself into a missile. Think of a drone of a certain size. It will have explosives built into its own body. It will circle around an area until it finds a target of opportunity, during which time it's flying like a normal drone. It's not a missile. It's fully in control. It's capable of takeoff and landing and so on and so forth. But the moment a target of opportunity presents itself, the controller can choose to instruct that drone to convert itself into a suicide drone effectively and go and crash into an enemy target, and its explosives obviously cause the effect that they do. So that's another form of use. And then within that, obviously, you've got the large drones that don't need to become suicide drones. They can simply carry missiles like large aircraft carry missiles or rockets or bombs, and use those to conduct direct strike.
How large are we talking about?
So the largest, India recently bought 31 Predators from the Americans just a couple of days ago, or agreed to buy. Those, wherever those will be deployed, they'll replace a current air squadron. They're the equivalent of effectively a fighter aircraft in terms of not just size, but also power requirements, runway requirements, infrastructure needed. You need the equivalent of an airbase-sized infrastructure in order to run a squadron of, Predator drones. So as far as the uses are concerned, what's very important for the audience to think about is, when I say that the Predator has a Hellfire missile on it, and that can go take out a terrorist hideout, Hamas also has Chinese-made DJI drones, which are the equivalent of what a cameraman at a wedding will be using to make your video, on which they mechanically jerry-rig just a very unsophisticated grenade or bomb and go and fly that drone right on top of an Israeli tank and drop it mechanically. So it's the crudest, most unsophisticated, cheapest technological solution in the world, but it's completely transformed Hamas's power to fight an asymmetric war against the Israelis.
Oof.
So keep in mind that the same principles are applicable in a very, very democratized way now. It's no longer the case that drone technology is only available to General Atomics in the United States.
Basically, terrorists may get their hands on drone technology.
They already have. They absolutely already have. And we saw that during the 7th October attacks, whose anniversary we just saw. Drones were used extensively. I mean, Hezbollah's used drones to conduct surveillance of Haifa port in Israel in order to send a message to the Israelis that if we can get a drone to come and do a flyover of your port, what's to say that drone can't also cause some damage in your port? So, this technology, like any technology, doesn't remain in a box. And sufficient engineering progress has been made now that, look at the Indian startup ecosystem, Ranveer. You've got hundreds of, drone startups, all of whom are able to put together, using some local and some international supply chains, at least a basic functional drone, a relatively small one. But in the wrong hands, these things, especially against soft civilian targets, can be extremely dangerous. But I just want to quickly finish on the uses again.
Yeah.
So the last thing I'll mention is how drones can start to team up in extremely efficient ways. And this comes down to battlefield AI, right? So when I gave you the analogy of Tesla full self-driving, except on the battlefield, what we're really talking about is an AI that's capable of not merely what we consider to be autopilot, right? Point A to point B, fly yourself straight and don't crash, but truly maneuver in combat, the equivalent of dogfighting or the equivalent of taking on complex missions in groups of drones without a human being in the loop of decision making at all. And so in that context, one really powerful example that I can give you again for the audience to be able to see a picture is, imagine an artillery unit that wants to hit a target. A drone flies over the target and uses a laser designator to paint that target's location. That data gets immediately synced up to the artillery unit, who now has precise target coordinates, and they're able to prosecute and effectively target their enemy. And so, that sort of combination is what we generally think about as the sensor to shooter link. So let me take a step back and try to describe the modern battlefield to you, Ranveer, and then go into the economics of it as a consequence, right? So way back in the day, in 2009-10, while I was at the LSE, I was studying the future of war under this man who unfortunately passed away recently. I'll honor him, Professor Christopher Coker, who was the head of the IR department at the London School of Economics, and someone that I ended up getting very, very close to because he taught the Strategic Affairs course at the LSE back then. And one of the things that him and I have written papers on is, and he's written a number of books on, is the future of war. And the concepts that we ended up thinking about would be most important on the modern battlefield were concepts like a networked battlefield, information-centric warfare, and sensor-to-shooter linkage, right? So to maximize the availability, density, reliability,
Efficiency.
and accuracy of information becomes the real arms race that's going on the battlefield. Now, I'll give you an example of how those theoretical predictions from 15 years ago have become a reality today. So if you look at the Ukrainian battlefield, both sides, Russian and Ukrainian commanders both, have made clear that almost everything we know of the modern battlefield from the 20th century has to be forgotten. I mean, for you and your audience, tell me, since World War II, wouldn't you agree that what we understand as modern war, not counter-terror and anti-terror operations and all that, but when two countries go to war, we think tanks, we think fighter jets, we think some combined arms between aircraft and tanks, and we think infantry, okay, there's aircraft carriers and there's destroyers and there's submarines, right? These are your major instruments of war. And then the way you go to war is you launch these large operational attacks with huge numbers of men going in at the same time, and you try to go and conquer and take over territory. A lot of the operational dynamics of that kind of war rely at the end of the day on your enemy not being able to perfectly observe your moves as you're making them. There has to be an element of surprise for anything to work in the field of military operations, right? I mean, if you're launching an attack and the enemy's been told 24 hours ago, this is exactly where the attack's coming, and they're preparing a nice welcoming party, you're probably, you're likely not to be very successful. Now, what Russian and Ukrainian generals are saying is that mode of war is gone fundamentally because the battlefield has turned totally transparent to both sides. Why? Because in the last 20 years, through a combination of satellites, drones, aircraft, and land-based sensors, many countries, and in this conflict, both sides have ended up establishing such a great data interface network on the battlefield that you're not able to move a large unit without instantaneous news going to the other side. That a Russian tank battalion is moving from point A to point B, and immediately you'll have some sort of strike or interdiction happen, and vice versa. So all of a sudden, people are like, we're not able to move on the battlefield because it's, you feel naked, you feel completely exposed. It's like there's always eyes watching you. That's the nature of the modern battlefield.
Hey, if you enjoyed today's clip, make sure you check out all the other clips we've uploaded on this channel. You'll find a clip related to almost every single topic as long as you're willing to search for it.